Hello, this is Brian, and this is going to be a different type of video. This isn't going to be survival based or anything like that. So if you want to go ahead and click off, that's up to you guys. If you guys want to watch, if you're a subscriber, if you guys want to watch it and see what I have to say, that's great. Basically, when I like to do mind experiments regarding physics and astronomy and trying to answer questions within the universe. And I came up with a theory doing these mind experiments when I was 12. Now, I haven't said anything, I haven't talked to anybody about it, well, except for some close friends in my family. And I decided, you know what, I'm going to put it out there. I might very well be wrong, but it seems to answer a lot of things for me, so I'm going to go ahead and put it out and see what happens. Basically, it is about how gravity works and defining how it works. Gravity is kind of a mysterious force. We know it exists, of course, but we don't know exactly how it works. And my theory or hypothesis basically tries to answer that question, what is it? So that once you answer that question and how it functions and are able to understand the physics of it, it answers a lot of other questions. So basically, I'm going to call it magnetic gravity, and I want to go ahead and clarify for everybody. This is not magnetism in the way that we look at magnetism. I simply say that because it's the easiest way for me to explain it. It's not going to behave as magnetism does. It is a separate force. Do not look at it and try to combine the two just because of the title I gave it. They are two separate things. And basically, I found all this out by looking, or by trying to solve what photons were and how they functioned. And when I realized how that worked, I realized that gravity itself, the definition for it had to change. There had to be an alteration in in how we perceive gravity in order for photons to truly exist. And not only exist, but actually be expected within a universe. So basically what I did was I tried to figure out how a particle, because photons also have matter, they act as a wave, but they also have matter, or mass to them, which means they have to be a physical object. So how could a physical object travel at the speed of light, which should be impossible, and act as a wave? The only answer to that is, as everyone knows, the laws of physics have to be followed, except objects that are not in contact with the fabric of space. If an object is not contacting that fabric, the laws of physics break down entirely. They aren't needed anymore. So the only way a photon could work is if it was not contacting the fabric. If the photon was physically separated from the two. But that should be physically impossible. So how could that happen? And the only way I could come up with for that to actually exist and to be a possibility is if you take gravity and you change it. Gravity still works the way it works, but you change its definition. So instead of being a generalized force, now it actually has a function, and that is in a magnetic way. Let's say, for example, you have fabric of space as a negative polarity and matter as a positive polarity. Space pulls towards matter because matter is denser, and matter therefore wins the fight between the two objects. As the fabric stretches towards the matter, the distance between each one of the particles in the fabric becomes stretched out, and that causes gravity. What if you took a particle, and since you have negative and positive polarity, if you took a particle and you made it negative polarity, the same as the fabric, what would happen then? And that's what I would envision. If I took a particle at the moment of its existence, when it was first formed, and I switched that polarity to the same as space, what would happen? And it turns out, at least in my mind, that space would retract from that object, just like a magnet repelling from itself, from another magnet of the same polarity. It would push away. So when it did that, when it pushed away, it would cause a ripple to form between the other particles that made up the fabric. And the particle itself, the photon, the actual particle, would be suspended in a void within the fabric of space. So it itself would not come in contact at any point with the fabric. In fact, it would be physically impossible for that particle to come in contact with anything. So the question then becomes, how does that work? And I bounced some ideas off of some of my friends. One friend said that can't possibly work because in your theory, you would have one base photon, but photons come in a myriad of different wavelengths. So how could that function? You know, you have blue light, red light, ultra energetic versions where it's like X-rays and things of that nature. So how could it function? How could you have your theory explain all the different forms of light? And I said it's fairly simple. If you take a photon at the moment of its existence and you apply, let's say, 10 parts of energy to it, it's going to form a very low wavelength because the repulsive action of the photon isn't as extreme against the fabric around it. It doesn't have enough energy to it. So it's going to have a very long wavelength around it. It's going to be, you know, red light, basically. You apply more energy to that photon at the moment of its creation, and the more energy it has, the more it's going to push against the fabric around it, and the more extreme that wave is going to become. So the more energy you apply to the photon when it's created, the more extreme the wave is. So you can explain all the different wavelengths of light. You can explain how all the light exists by using this theory or this hypothesis. And then he came to me and he said he thought of another problem. And I had to admit, I kind of stumbled on this one for a little bit. He said, if light is outside of the fabric of space and doesn't come in contact with it, how can the fabric of space and the gravity then associated with it affect a photon's movement around, say, large bodies of mass where photons will have a tendency to curve? So how could that happen? And I sat there, I said, I have to get back to you on that one. I got to think about that. And I ended up coming up with the answer eventually, but it took me a little while. And that is, the best way I can describe it, because I can't describe it very well, the best way I can describe the answer is to take a marble and put it inside of a rubber band. Okay? The rubber band represents the fabric of space around the marble. And the marble is, of course, the photons. So you have a gap between the fabric of space and the marble. If you, like I said, gravity pulls space towards the matter. So it's going to create a stretched out appearance in the fabric of space. So if you take that marble, which is a perfectly round rubber band sitting directly inside, you know, the photon sitting directly inside of a perfect sphere, and you take that sphere now and you elongate it as it passes a gravitational object. Okay? So it goes from being round to being elongated, because this portion of fabric now is weaker because it's being pulled. Then what's going to happen to that marble now that was sitting right inside of it? It's going to fall down into that gap, and the fabric behind it is going to push it into that gap. So now, instead of traveling straight, or instead of traveling like this, it's going to travel like that as it's falling into that gap in the that's formed from the gravity that it's then passing by. And I told him that, and he said, well, I can't argue that one. That actually makes sense. And if you sit down and you look at it, it does. It makes complete and perfect sense as to why it would work in that way. So basically, to recap, to kind of explain something, I know I'm kind of rambling a little bit because I'm trying to get my thoughts out. But to recap a little bit, I think that gravity is essentially a magnetic form of another version of magnetism. Not the same, it is a separate force, so don't take magnetism and apply it to gravity because it's not going to work. I'm saying that, like I said, because it's the easiest way to explain it. Space is one polarity, matter is another. They attract to each other. Matter always wins because the fabric of space is weaker. So it is always attracted to matter, not the other way around. Okay. Photons can exist at that point because they, if you have space being polarized, the fabric being polarized, now if you have a form of matter that is the same polarity, it no longer has to interact with the fabric. It can still be within the universe, but it doesn't have to obey the same laws, which is why photons can both be a wave and matter, because when you take a photon, a form of matter, and you apply the same polarity as the fabric of space, now waves form around that matter and cause it to act as a wave even though it has physical mass. So that's how light works, in my opinion. And I basically took this concept and applied it to other problems within the laws, within the universe, how things formed and how things were created. And I'll get into that in part 2. But like I said, this is just a hypothesis. This is just me kind of coming up with an idea, and I've had it for a long time, and I've kind of been perfecting it over the years, and bouncing ideas off of people and seeing if I could answer problems that they come up with. And I think I've gotten into a point now where I'm comfortable putting it out there and letting people critique it. And I could be wrong. I probably am. Most theories are wrong. Most hypotheses are wrong. But I think it answers a lot of the problems. I think it answers a lot of questions. So stay tuned for part 2. I will be going over how I believe it affects black holes. See you then. Bye-bye.